Hello and welcome to Dialogue. Chinese President Xi Jinping is in Vietnam as part of his first overseas state visit of the year, which also includes stops in Malaysia and Cambodia. The trip comes as China and Vietnam mark the 75th anniversary of their diplomatic relations this year, raising expectations for deeper political trust and expanded economic cooperation between the two socialist neighbors. What are the top priorities on President Xi's agenda in Vietnam? How have bilateral ties progressed in recent years? And as Washington's tariff war continues to cast a shadow over global trade, how will China's economic engagement with Southeast Asia evolve? Join us for today's discussion live from Beijing. I'm Xu Jinduo. Joining me today are Professor John Gong from University of International Business and Economics, and Nguyen Quoc Giang, visiting fellow of the Vietnam Study Program at the IC's Yusof Ishak Institute, and Surat Gupta, Senior Asia-Pacific International Relations Policy Specialist at the Institute for China-America Studies. Welcome to the show. Mr. Gupta, we'll start with you. The trip, of course, first we'll start with Vietnam and then, Cambodia, Malaysia. The three countries, they all are members of the ASEAN, the 10 ASEAN economic body there. We know ASEAN has been China's largest trading partner for the past several years. So what do you make of this visit?
What I make of this visit is that the Chinese president and the Chinese leadership more broadly would like to deepen their relations with the neighborhood. They just had an important party meeting with regard to neighborhood relations. And I think especially at this 75th anniversary of China-Vietnam relations, I think it's a very important anniversary. The relationship has been on a very good stabilizing track for the last couple of years, for the last decade. If I understand right, I think this is the third or the fourth visit by President Xi in some capacity to Vietnam. And therefore, I think the most important priority at this point is China showing to its neighbors that it is a dependable and responsible player in the international system and that it wants to deepen comprehensive relations all around, especially trade and economic relations.
Mm-hmm. Well, John, as Mr. Gupta mentioned recently, yes, there is an important central conference on neighboring countries. So President Xi gave a speech during that conference. And then what's your interpretation of the conference? Why is it so important? Why China, again, basically make this issue stand out on the importance of having a better relationship with neighboring countries?
Well, I think President Xi emphasized the importance of furthering relationship with our neighboring countries. I think this is particularly important against the backdrop of a worsening global political situation right now. I think the entire rules-based international order has been upended by Washington, and I think it underlies the all more importance of keeping a stable and growing relationship with our neighbors, particularly these countries that have very extensive economic relationships with China. So I think this is probably the most important point in President Xi's visit.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Jiang, how do you characterize the ties between the two socialist countries, China and Vietnam? We know it's 75th year of the establishment of the relationship there. But what about the current relationship? Anything standing out?
Well, China is the first country that offer its diplomatic tie with Vietnam and have been seen one of their most trusted friends for Vietnam. And if you look at all the histories on the recent cooperation between Vietnam and China, both in terms of political cooperation and economic cooperation, China is solely the most important partner for Vietnam in the region. So if we look at, for example, the bilateral trade volume between Vietnam and China for the last year is $260 billion US, and Vietnam is China's biggest trade partner in ASEAN. So I think practically, politically, and even in terms of friendship, I think Vietnam considers China as one of the most important partners in the region and the most trusted friends. And normally we all say a friend in need is a friend indeed, especially after all the disruptions because of their quote-unquote Liberation Day. I think Vietnam needs China and other partners in ASEAN more than ever.
Well, of course, on the first on arrival, Monday, President Xi penned an article. He talked about delivering more benefits to the two peoples, strengthening people-to-people exchanges, and forging a closer bond between the two peoples, and also enhancing multilateral collaboration. This is about, I believe, trade, global trade, and promoting Asia's prosperity and revitalization. Why do you think President Xi highlighted these specific goals?
Well, I think Vietnam to China is special in the sense that not only we share a very prospering economic relationship, we also have our shared past. We have a long history of dealing with each other. We also share a lot of the same political system, the same political ideas and ideologies. I think this is a very unique. Actually, President Xi's article talk about this point that both sides are socialist countries and we have this common interest in furthering this cause. So I think, in a sense, Vietnam is very special, even among the set of neighbors we have here, let alone, the thriving economic relationship between the two sides over the last few years.
Well, Mr. Jiang, also on Monday, the Vietnamese, General Secretary of the party, Vietnamese Socialist Party or Communist Party, obviously, Le Lam, he wrote also a piece on the Chinese newspaper, People's Daily. It talked about basically a new era of development of Vietnam-China friendship. Share with us your understanding of this article. What's the message here?
I think the message here is very clearly that Vietnam is also embarking on a new era of development. And in this new era of development, I think we can collaborate much more in terms of, both political cooperation, the party-to-party ties, economic cooperation between two economies which are on trade dependent, which are also have the interest in protecting the global trade order, and also in terms of multilateral cooperation, because we also want to uphold the rules-based order in the region and protect peace and stability in the region. So we have a lot of common causes to protect and to promote in the region. At the same time, we historically, Vietnam and China are friends, and we share a lot of ideological alignment with each other, so we can support each other definitely in terms of not only fostering prosperity for both countries, but also promote peace and stability in the region as well. So I think that's a key message that General Secretary To Lam sends to the Chinese public and also to the Vietnamese public as well.
So, Mr. Zhang, basically you are saying, Secretary To Lam he also talked about the global trade. Can we say, his idea and the idea of President Xi are similar? Basically, like we need to continue to safeguard this multilateral trade, in which both countries actually enjoyed or benefited from such a system. Is that so?
Yeah, definitely. Vietnam has benefited a lot from integrating into the global trade order, similar to China has done as well. So I think we have a lot of interest in promoting and keeping the global trade order, especially upholding the One Trade Organization principle and protecting the free trade and open trade to our partners around the world. So I think Vietnam and China shares a lot of interest in promoting trade multilaterally, but also in terms of bilateral trade is very important, because I think Vietnam and China have been integrated very deeply into the global supply chain, and Vietnam needs a lot of support from China, as well as China would benefit a lot from supporting Vietnam in integrating into the supply chain in the region. So I think we have a lot of common interests, both bilaterally and multilaterally, to uphold the trade order, not only regionally, but also globally.
Mr. Gupta, we know that this visit takes place at a time of rising uncertainty, partly because of what happened. We all know Liberation Day, right? So how do you see this regional stability or regional integration? How important is that?
I think it has taken even added importance after the direction in which the Trump administration is moving on trade and tariffs. I think it's important now for regional integration and even intercontinental integration, basically Europe and Asia becoming more integrated from an economic standpoint. Of course, first, Asia itself needs to deepen its own integration, and China and Vietnam are a splendid example of that integration that's taking place. One has to understand, in the United States, the Trump administration has these very outlandish views about trade deficits, etc. Of course, China has its issues because has problems with the Trump administration because the tariffs imposed are so high. But I would say that the relative dependence of Vietnam on foreign trade is that much more greater, and so Vietnam, I think, is going to be impacted in a very significant way because Mr. Trump actually is, in a way, unfortunately, trying to compete against Vietnam in terms of just medium technology intensive goods in terms of investment and production. And I think the Americans are making very poor choices, but this is going to be at the expense to some extent of countries like Vietnam, which used to export these into the US to the US consumer. And therefore, it's important that regional integration is not just about production and supply chains, but it's also important to build out consumption in the area so that much of what is regionally produced through the vertically integrated production chains is thereafter consumed. Much of it is consumed in Asia, and that would be a virtuous cycle. And I think that's the area that we should also be focusing at. But the question you asked, how important is regional integration? It's taken much greater importance, and I'd like to see Asia be getting more integrated with Europe also in terms of trade and economic ties.
This kind of integration is a natural development, I mean, a natural response to the pressure from, let's say, from Washington. Basically, all the nations, face the pressure from Japan, Korea, Vietnam, China, ASEAN countries, Australia, European countries. So there's a push or pressure for them to work together. I mean, to at least alleviate some of the challenges. Can we say so, Mr. Gupta?
Yes, absolutely. I think there's a real strong driver happening out here in terms of the need to deepen supply chains and deepen integration, and to also, as I said, alter the type of integration. For example, Vietnam, one of the things that it could do, given the pressure the US is placing, is try to have, it sources a lot of intermediate inputs from China, try to build out its own manufacturing ecosystem so that some of those intermediate inputs are produced in Vietnam. It could be through Chinese investment in Vietnam, and therefore it will not just look as if it's Chinese goods transshipped via Vietnam to Western markets. So Vietnam has its own challenges, but I think it's not just in terms of low and medium technology intensive manufacturing, in area of digital, in areas of AI chips. I think the range of areas, electric vehicles, large capacity batteries, green technologies, that range needs to widen considerably, and the depth it needs to deepen significantly more.
Well, John, obviously, as Mr. Jiang mentioned earlier, $260 billion trade last year between Vietnam and China. Vietnam is now the fourth largest trading partner of China. This is something, I would say. And of course, this is after basically South Korea being the second, Japan being the third largest trading partner of China. So you can see that Asian countries are significantly important to each other here.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the four countries you mentioned, essentially a part of a global value chain system that's driving the global trade for the last 20-some years. And a lot of that activity is actually indeed centered in East Asia, Northeast Asia. I think from Vietnam's perspective, I think Mr. Gupta is absolutely right that there should be more investment in Vietnam so that there be more products being sourced domestically in Vietnam, as opposed to be interpreted by Washington as China using Vietnam as a place for transit trade into the United States. Well, but if you look at the Vietnamese response to the tariff challenge on Liberation Day, it's noticeably different from China's, and I can fully understand that. The reason behind this is that Vietnam is a heavily reliant upon trade. The trade volume itself is actually about twice as its GDP. So what is here in China is less than 20%. I think it's like a 15 or 16% of total GDP here. So Vietnam can survive without the trade being cut off from the United States. So I think this is something very understandable. But China's situation is very different. The Trump administration's entire target is actually focusing mostly on China. And if we responded this way, we won't get a break from Washington. I think from China's perspective, we need to show some strength in negotiation. We need to show some cards to Mr. Trump.
Well, and also interesting, Mr. Gupta mentioned about that. I think I was also asked this morning by a Vietnamese media, actually. It's about the consumption boosting efforts inside China. I mean, China is a huge market. I mean, once the consumption level raises, I mean, China with 1.4 billion people, I think we are confident to consume imports, from export from Vietnam, from Malaysia, from Cambodia, from Southeast Asian countries.
Yeah.
We can do that. We can reduce the reliance on other countries.
You're absolutely right. Raising consumption level as a percentage of GDP is the way to balance trade. That actually diverts some of exports to the domestic market, as well as actually encouraging more imports from other countries, including the United States, including Vietnam. Right now, domestic consumption is about a little bit less than 40% of GDP. And I think for a lot of industrialized countries, it's even close to 70-80%. So I think a lot of room to grow in that area. At a very fundamental level, I think the way to address trade grievances is not through rolling back trade, but actually increasing trade, right? By increasing exports to some other countries. We can certainly increase trade from the United States and from Vietnam as well. Indeed, it's happening. I mean, you look at I start just my own daily experiences. I mean, you look at the fruits, for example, in China's market these days. A lot of them actually coming from Southeast Asian countries, and a lot of more exotic tropical fruits come onto the Chinese market that we never had a chance to enjoy. When we were little kids. Yeah. So I think this is indeed happening, especially against the potential of the building the railway connection between China and Southeast Asia. One of the agenda items I think they're going to discuss this time during President Xi's visit is about providing railway connectivity between China and Hanoi and the Haiphong.
And also inside of Vietnam.
Exactly.
Yes. Mr. Jiang, of course, if you look at the trade, of course, this is rich in content. We mentioned about infrastructure, connectivity, also about the green energy, right? I mean, China can share its technology with the Vietnamese side, and also probably in other area too, digital trade, the technology, for example, and also people-to-people exchange. Like 3.7 million Chinese tourists went to Vietnam last year, and 24,000 Vietnamese students are studying in China. These numbers are very impressive, and also China is the largest market for Vietnamese agriculture products. Tell us more in that. In what way we can do more probably to bring the two countries together?
Well, I think I remember one very interesting definition from a Chinese professor about China's modernization is China is a model of open source modernization. So when you improve things, you create technologies, you improve the high-speed railway system in China, you're more willing to share with countries like Vietnam, like Cambodia, like Laos. And I think that's very important motivation for countries like Vietnam to have more connection with China, not only in terms of economic cooperation, but also in terms of political infrastructure and people-to-people connection as well. And very interesting fact that you mentioned about 20,000 Vietnamese students in China, I think that number has been growing quite drastically over the past few years. So previously, many Vietnamese students chose to go to Western countries like Australia, UK, US to study, but increasingly now they want to study in China because of the very impressive economic growth story that China brings to the world. So I think that's one very important link for China to show to their neighbors, including Vietnam, about the stories of Chinese development and how they can really help other countries to develop to their level, not just kicking away their development letters like what we are criticizing the policy of the Trump administration's recent tariff liberation day, quote unquote. So I think it's important to emphasize that aspect of cooperation between China and Southeast Asian countries, including Vietnam, for the next few years, especially under the very uncertain global situations.
Mr. Zhang, when the two leaders, the Chinese side and Vietnamese side, they met and talk, what are their priorities? There's a report of 40 agreements to be signed between the two sides. So what tops the agenda here?
Well, there's a lot of things to discuss, and obviously Vietnam and China are both very big markets and very growing markets. So obviously we're talking about cooperation, but realistically, we have so many things to cooperate. So just today, I think there is an agreement that Vietjet, Vietnam's biggest private airline, will buy some airplanes from Comac, the very big Chinese producers. And tomorrow, there would be the first flight that use Chinese airplanes in Vietnamese domestic markets. I think which very, very big breakthrough, because normally we only use Airbus or Boeing. And secondly, there have been a lot of discussion about infrastructure projects in Vietnam as well, which are very important because developing economies like Vietnam, we really have a lot of problems in building infrastructure, not only because of the lack of finance, but also the lack of technological knowledge, the lack of technological transfer. And if China is willing to provide more of the knowledge and finance in building infrastructure project in Vietnam, I think that would be a really big boost in the bilateral tie between Vietnam and China. So obviously 40 agreements and a lot of very diverse topics, from education to infrastructure to green energy to EV. And I'm sure that in the next few years we're going to see more deepening economic and political and cultural ties between Vietnam and China.
Mr. Gupta, earlier you mentioned about the acquisition from Washington, Chinese companies rerouting their products through Vietnam. But there's a Harvard research showing that this is not really that case. Because, for example, Apple supplier, for example, they would move or invest in Vietnam simply because there are preferential policies. For example, labor force is a bit cheaper than in China, or land probably is cheaper in Vietnam. And that's if you look at the history from European countries, the U.S. industrialization to Japan, South Korea, and then to say Taiwan, Hong Kong, or Singapore, and then to the Chinese mainland and to Vietnam, Southeast Asia, isn't that this organic movement or migration of industries, or industrialization rather?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely correct. It's absolutely organic. What I was just referring to is the American allegation, and it's a false allegation. Chinese companies are in Vietnam, or Chinese exports of intermediate goods are sought in Vietnam because those are then embodied in products which are produced in Vietnam. It's a completely organic process. And that's why in that context, I would suggest to the Vietnamese, just like China did, it initially imported its intermediate inputs from abroad, embodied those and assembled those and exported those out. And gradually, rather than having to import those intermediate imports, that domestic content, that local content got widened and was sourced in China. And in the same way, it would be, if the Vietnamese should also begin to try to see how they can source more of those intermediate inputs in China. What I would, on the other hand, recommend to Chinese enterprises is, just like the Japanese and and South Korean companies, the way to go now is to, of course, you have to go and do foreign investment, go into these countries, and rather than use Chinese intermediate imports, try to find local suppliers out there. And that's the way Japanese companies became these behemoths. That's the way I think Chinese companies are going to become real foreign invested superpowers by not just importing their intermediate imports from China or their labor from China, but for sourcing it locally. And this is how that one really rises up the ranks. And I think that virtuous process is happening, and deepening of regional integration is the process that kind of really consolidates this process and allows it to flourish. And I'm really looking forward to the deepening of China ASEAN and China Vietnam ties in this regard.
Well, John, this is a process. I mean, it's changing process, of course. Now we are seeing a strengthening process. China, Vietnam, China, ASEAN countries here, in terms of supply chain. And at the same time, we do see there are multiple channels, for example, mechanism being established. For example, there is a 3+3 mechanism, basically, in the area of diplomacy, defense, and also the public security. Basically, the senior officials, ministers, meet each other on a regular basis to deal with the differences, in the South China Sea or the East Sea in the Vietnamese term, and then to ensure long-term stable relationship, but long-term development between the two countries. That's critically important too, right, for the regional development here.
Well, absolutely. I think in this region, economic integration is vital for economic development, of course, but I think also the kind of a cooperation you just mentioned, the keywords I pay particular attention to is defense and security. When countries cooperate along these fronts, that means a lot. I think we all Asians, I have this vision that Asians should look out for themselves. This entire region used to be colonized. Vietnam is no exception to that. All countries semi-colonized, and we share the same past here, share the same history. And now, we take our destiny into our own hands, and we have a very peaceful environment. And I think it's all the more important to cooperate on these fronts, especially I think in defense and security. I think when we have this kind of a cooperation, no country can drive a wedge among our Asian countries. So I think this is a very significant development, and it indicates that the bond between Vietnam and China moving forward is going to be very strong.
Mr. Jiang, look into the future, China-Vietnamese relationship here, people-to-people exchanges, with an increasing number of young people basically coming or visiting each other. What's your what kind of outlook do you see, for the relationship of the two countries here?
Well, I think it's important to note that mutual understanding is very important, and mutual political trust is very important to bridging differences. Obviously, we are friends, we are neighbors, but also we have differences, especially in the South China Sea. But if we don't seek to have more mutual understandings, more dialogue, I think it would be really hard for each other to reconcile with each other and then to move the relationship forward. And because of that, so for the past few years, when we are seeing increasingly collaboration and connection between the younger generations, not only in the leadership, but also among the public as well, I think there could be a very bright and positive development of China and Vietnam relationship moving forward. And I think this is not only very important for Vietnam and China individually, but very important for ASEAN as a region in the future, because when we can collaborate with each other, I think we can really propose prosperity for the whole Asian nations, including China, Vietnam, and the rest of the Southeast Asian nations.
So are you saying that you have a similar vision, in terms of relationship between China, Vietnam, and also China ASEAN countries here?
Obviously, definitely, we are neighbors, right? With China and ASEAN, China, Vietnam are neighbors, and neighbor is there forever. So we cannot really escape from our neighbor. So we have to make the best of that. And the best of that is that we can enhance our economic cooperation, we can enhance political trust, and we can solve our differences via peaceful means and via a stable mechanism. So if we can do that, I think we can bring to the ASEAN century in this 21st century, and will bring prosperity to all of the people nearly
Oh, oh,
2
oh.
billion people.
John,
Yeah, I would just
Our
add,
10
I would just add
seconds.
one sentence to end this program. China will never call Vietnam the 51st province of China. Enough for that, okay?
Yeah, neighbors will be there forever. With that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also watch us on the CGTN app on YouTube. Thank you for being with us. I'm Shi Qinduo. See you next time.